At 9:14 on a Tuesday night in October, my upstairs neighbor knocked on my door and asked if I had any candles. By 11:47, we were still sitting on my kitchen floor in the dark, 2 glasses deep into a bottle of wine she'd carried down from her apartment, and her cat named Det had fallen asleep across my feet. She hadn't planned to stay that long. Neither had I planned anything about that night, which, I've come to understand, was exactly the problem. My name is Asher Crane. I was 29 that fall, working as a landscape architect for a mid-sized firm in Portland that specialized in urban green spaces, the kind of work where you spend mornings in mud boots and afternoons convincing city planners that a rain garden is not the same thing as a pond. I had moved to Portland 14 months earlier, after ending a 4-year relationship that had stopped working about 2 years before we finally stopped. I picked Portland partly because I had a job offer, and partly because no one I knew lived there, which at the time felt less like loneliness and more like privacy. The building I moved into was a 6-story brick walk-up in the Hawthorne neighborhood, the kind that had good bones and questionable plumbing and a door buzzer that worked about 60% of the time. The apartment above mine belonged to Phoebe Hartwell. She was 27, a freelance wedding photographer who had built her business almost entirely through word of mouth, and an Instagram feed that made every rain-soaked outdoor ceremony look like a deliberate creative choice rather than a logistical disaster. She'd lived in the building longer than I had, and she knew everyone by name, which I found equal parts impressive and exhausting, because I had been avoiding learning anyone's name as a matter of principle. We had met properly about a week after I moved in, when I knocked on her door, because I could hear water running through my ceiling at midnight and assumed the worst. It turned out to be a faulty shut-off valve under her sink, the kind of thing that takes 4 minutes to fix if you know where to look. I did. She stood in her doorway in an oversized flannel shirt and mismatched socks, holding her cat under one arm, and said, "I was going to call the super tomorrow." I said, "The super charges $200 for this." She said, "How do you know what the super charges?" I said, "The notice in the lobby." "Did you read it?" She thought about it. "I read part of it." I fixed the valve. She made tea I hadn't asked for, and I drank it because it was 11:30 and I wasn't going to be rude. We talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular. The cat, whose name I learned was Det, sat on the counter and knocked my mug toward the edge 3 separate times. After that, we were the kind of neighbors who graduated past the hallway nod. She texted me once when a package was left outside my door during a rainstorm. I held her mail for 2 weeks when she was shooting a wedding in Sonoma. We had gone for coffee exactly 3 times, always unplanned, always because we had been leaving the building at the same moment. I told myself that was just proximity doing what proximity does. The power outage on that Tuesday in October knocked out the whole block. I had been working late on a set of drainage schematics, and when my screen went dark, I sat in the sudden quiet for a moment before accepting that I was done for the evening. I had one functioning flashlight and a pack of tea lights I'd bought, for a reason I could no longer remember. I was arranging them on my counter when the knock came. Phoebe stood in the hallway with Det tucked under one arm and a wine bottle under the other. She was wearing a wool cardigan the color of dried moss and had her dark hair in a knot that suggested she'd planned to go to bed an hour ago. "I don't have any candles," she said. "You seem like someone who would have candles." "Why do I seem like that?" "You have houseplants. Only people who think long-term own houseplants." I opened the door wider. "I have tea lights." "That's better anyway." She stepped inside without being fully invited, which she did with the ease of someone who had never found thresholds particularly meaningful. Det dropped from her arm the moment his feet touched my floor, made a single inspection lap around the living room, and determined my apartment was acceptable. I gave her 3 tea lights and a book of matches. She didn't leave. Instead, she set the candles on my kitchen table and began opening the wine with a corkscrew she'd produced from her cardigan pocket. "You brought a corkscrew," I said. "I brought the wine. The corkscrew is implied." We sat at the kitchen table first, then somehow migrated to the floor, when the table felt too formal for 2 people in the dark, with nothing to look at but each other. She talked about a wedding she'd shot that weekend, a ceremony on Sauvie Island where it had rained sideways during the vows, and the officiant had delivered the entire thing under a golf umbrella while the couple held hands and laughed. "The photos are some of my best," she said. "The ones that look like a disaster usually are. Do you always find the angle that makes the bad thing look intentional?" She looked at me over the rim of her glass. "I thought you'd been paying attention to my Instagram. Your building profile says what you do. For 7 months, you've been 2 floors below me and you just read my building profile?" I didn't answer that, because the honest answer was that I had read it 6 weeks after I moved in and then continued learning things about her at a comfortable, responsible distance. She seemed to understand this without being told. She had that quality, the ability to read exactly what you'd left unsaid and decide whether to push or let it rest. That night, she let it rest. Det knocked my water glass off the counter at 10:30. Phoebe didn't apologize, just set the glass upright and said, "He does this everywhere. I think he's checking to see if gravity is still working." I said, "Has it ever failed?" She considered this seriously. "Not on his watch." It was the kind of conversation that moves sideways, that starts with something ordinary and keeps sliding until you're somewhere neither person intended. By 11, we had covered the wedding in Sonoma she'd almost missed because of a delayed flight, the city council meeting I'd attended, where a man in a fleece vest had spent 11 minutes arguing against permeable pavement, the neighborhood in Ohio where she'd grown up, where everyone's front yard was identical by informal agreement, and the fact that I had ended my last relationship by saying the words, "I think we want different things," in the parking lot of a Whole Foods, which she correctly identified as the most specific yet vague breakup location she had ever heard. "Different things meaning what?" she asked. "Meaning she wanted someone who came home and was fully present, and I came home and kept working in my head." Phoebe was quiet for a moment. Det walked across my lap and settled beside her knee. "That doesn't sound like different things," she said. "That sounds like one thing she wanted that you weren't giving her." That landed with the precision of something I'd been thinking for a while, but hadn't finished articulating. "Yeah," I said. "I know." "Did you want to give it to her?" I thought about it. I wanted to want to. She nodded slowly. "That's not the same thing." "No." "So you moved somewhere where you didn't know anyone." "Portland has excellent urban forestry." "Asher." I looked at her. She was watching me the way she probably watched light fall across a subject before deciding where to aim her camera. Not intrusively, just waiting to see what the available conditions would give her. "I moved somewhere where I could figure out what I actually wanted without anyone watching," I said. "That's the more accurate version." "And have you?" The question sat between us. The candle on the floor between our knees threw her face into warm shadow, the kind of light that makes everything feel momentarily honest. "I'm getting there," I said. She smiled, brief and private, like the answer had confirmed something she'd been testing quietly. Her shoulder was almost touching mine, whereas we sat against the kitchen cabinets. She didn't move away. "You know what I've noticed about you," she said. "That I own house plants. That every time you almost say something real, you make a joke first, like a warning shot. You've known me 7 months. I've lived above you 7 months. There's a difference." She tilted her head. "Warning shots at 2-second intervals. Consistent pattern." I didn't argue, because she was right, and because arguing would have been exactly the kind of deflection she'd just described. Instead, I said, "What do you do when you're about to say something real?" She considered that. "I usually just say it, and then regret it later if I need to." Efficient. Terrifying, actually. We stayed until the first bottle was finished, and neither of us opened the second. The power came back at 12:40, sudden and bright, and we both flinched at the overhead light like people who had adjusted to the dark without noticing. Phoebe gathered Det, who resented being relocated from my floor. At the door, she turned and looked at me. "Thanks for the tea lights," she said. "You brought the wine. Consider it a fair trade." She stood in the open doorway. "I meant what I said about the warning shots." "I know. Just so you knew I wasn't saying it to say something." "Phoebe." She raised an eyebrow. I know, I said again, quieter. She nodded once, like that was enough for now, and went upstairs. We didn't do anything about it for 5 more weeks. That was entirely my doing. She had told me clearly, in a language I understood, that she was paying attention to me. I had understood her clearly, and I had decided to think about it instead of act on it, which is the particular kind of self-sabotage that feels like caution from the inside. We still got coffee when we happened to leave at the same time. She stopped by once to ask if I'd heard something in the walls. I hadn't, but I came upstairs to check and ended up staying for 2 hours while she edited photos and I revised a planting plan I'd been stuck on. I sat at her table and she sat at her desk, and we worked in parallel without feeling the need to fill the silence, which, if I'd been honest with myself, was already telling me something. November arrived with a particular Portland insistence that involves steady rain and the smell of wet cedar everywhere. On the second Saturday of that month, I was in the grocery store on Division Street when I ran into Phoebe at the flower section. She was examining dahlias with the focus of a person who took this kind of thing seriously. Debt wasn't with her, obviously. For a wedding, I asked. She looked up without startling. Research. I'm shooting a fall editorial next week, and I want to know what's actually in season, not what Pinterest thinks is in season. Those are in season. She looked at me. How do you know what flowers are in season? Landscape architect. Right. She selected 3 stems. Do you know all the flowers or just the outdoor ones? I know enough to know those are Cafeo light dahlias and they're almost past peak. Buy them now. She bought 4 more. At the register, she said, "Do you want to come over tonight? I'm making soup. Actual soup, not something from a can." As opposed to your usual soup situation? I made soup from scratch last February, and I want credit for it to count ongoing. I almost said I had plans, which was a lie I had used with other people and had never once used with Phoebe, and I was not going to start. What kind of soup? I asked. French onion. That takes 3 hours. I know. I started it an hour ago. I'm here for the Gruyere. I found the Gruyere. She paid for it. I showed up at her door at 7. That was the evening. Everything shifted from a direction we'd been circling to something we were actually moving toward. We ate at her kitchen table with the overhead light on a dimmer, and her record player going, something with too much acoustic guitar. She talked about her business more than she usually did. A project she'd been developing alongside the weddings, a series of portraits of the invisible people who make the wedding industry run. Florists, bakers, seamstresses, the woman in Gresham, who rents out vintage tableware by the piece. People who work every Saturday all season and spend Sundays unrecognized. It's the project you actually want to do, I said. The weddings pay the rent. I didn't say it wasn't complicated. I said it's the one you want. She was quiet, turning her spoon in the bowl. It doesn't make money yet. But you've already started it. She looked up. How do you know I've started it? I hesitated. The prints on your wall in the living room, the bakery woman, the florist with the canvas apron. She hadn't shown them to me. They'd been in the background the evenings I'd come upstairs. She registered that I'd noticed and filed it somewhere. You pay attention when you think no one's watching, she said. I'm usually watching. Something moved in her expression, quiet and careful. She put her spoon down. Asher. I know. Do you? Because you've known for a while, and you keep knowing without doing anything about it. That was as direct as she'd ever been with me. I had asked for it, more or less. I'm trying not to do this badly, I said. There's a version of careful that's just afraid. I know that too. She leaned her elbows on the table and looked at me steadily. I'm not her, the parking lot woman. I almost smiled despite what my chest was doing. I know. Then stop making me prove it. I reached across the table. My hand covered hers. She looked down at it, then back up at me, and something in her expression settled. Not resolved, not certain. Just decided. I came around the table. She stood. I kissed her beside the stove, with the soup still warm on the back burner, and her dahlias in a jar on the counter, and Det watching from the top of the refrigerator with the detachment of someone who had seen more dramatic things in his time. When we separated, she touched the front of my shirt. About time, she said. I was building up to it. For 5 weeks. I'm methodical. She kissed the corner of my mouth. I noticed. We had 3 weeks before the email arrived. In those 3 weeks, I learned that Phoebe kept heat 2 degrees warmer than any reasonable person required, that she narrated Det's motivations aloud in a voice slightly different from her regular speaking voice, and that she was a meticulous editor of her own photographs and a generous editor of everyone else's feelings. She came downstairs twice when I was working late and fell asleep on my couch at an angle that should have been uncomfortable, and I covered her with the throw blanket and worked until I couldn't anymore and fell asleep in the chair. I learned that she had followed an ex-boyfriend to Portland 3 years ago, that he had taken a position in Seattle when they ended things, and she had stayed because she had clients and a lease, and because leaving felt too much like admitting defeat. I learned all of this in the ordinary way, through conversation that happened while one of us was making coffee, or walking to a bookstore on Belmont, or sitting on her fire escape in the cold, because she had claimed the morning air was worth it. Then on a Sunday afternoon, she went quiet in the middle of a sentence, looked at her phone, and put it face down on the coffee table. I watched her. What is it? She picked it back up and read the email again. A destination wedding company based in Florence. They want to bring me on as their lead photographer for a 6-month contract starting in January. That's significant. It's a lot of money. And the portfolio exposure. She set the phone down. It would change everything about what I'm able to do after. After the 6 months. Yeah. I understood the architecture of what she wasn't saying. 6 months in Florence starting in January meant she would be gone by the time the winter really settled in and wouldn't be back until July. It meant the project I had just found, the person I had just stopped being afraid of, would be on another continent for longer than we had known each other as anything more than neighbors. When do they need an answer? I asked. 2 weeks. I said nothing for a moment. Then I said what I should not have said first. You should take it. Phoebe looked at me, not hurt, measuring. You didn't even pause. It's a major opportunity. I know what it is. Her voice had flattened slightly. That was fast. I'm not trying to. It sounded like a door closing. She stood and walked to the window. The street below was Sunday afternoon, quiet, leaves down, gutters running from yesterday's rain. I'm not asking you to make the decision for me. I'm telling you something significant and giving you the room to respond. And I responded. You responded with what you thought I needed to hear. That stopped me. She turned and looked at me. The honest answer, she said, is not the first thing you said. She was correct. The honest answer was uglier and less clean. I walked to where she stood. The honest answer is that I don't want you to go. The other honest answer is that I've done this once already. Let someone leave something behind because of me. And I spent 2 years watching it become resentment I had no good response to. I can't do that again. Something in her face opened slightly. I am not her. I know. And I'm not asking permission. I'm asking what you actually want. I want you not to go. The words came out simpler than I expected. I want you to stay. And I know that's selfish. And I know what this contract means for your work. And I'm not going to pretend I don't want both of those things at the same time. She searched my face. Then she exhaled. Okay, that's what I wanted. Not an answer, just the truth. The truth is plenty. She came back to the couch. We sat with the problem between us instead of around it, which felt entirely different. She talked about what the contract would actually mean, the portfolio, the financial runway it would give her to develop the portrait series without worrying about cash flow for once, the kind of access she'd never get shooting Willamette Valley wineries. I listened the way I'd learned to listen to her, without filling the space with my own reassurances. What would you do? She asked, actually. I'd visit, more than once. Portland has direct flights to Rome. That's a long flight for someone who brings work on vacation. I'd bring less work. She looked at me sideways. Asher. I'm serious. I would figure out how to be there. Not to keep an eye on you, because I don't want to stop building this, because geography got difficult. You've been building this for about 3 weeks. I've been building this for 7 months, 3 weeks ago, I stopped pretending otherwise. Her expression shifted. Not a smile, exactly. Something more private. She reached over and took my hand. I'm scared, she said. Of going? Of it working perfectly without you, and coming back and having lost something I didn't protect. I understood exactly what she meant. I had spent 14 months in Portland running a version of that same calculation. Then protect it, I said. I'll do the same from here. She looked down at our joined hands. What does that actually look like? Calls when I say I'll call. Visits on actual calendars, not someday plans. Being honest when it's hard instead of strategic when it's easier. I tightened my hand around hers. The burden has to be equal. If it starts not being equal, we say so. She was quiet. Det appeared from the hallway and climbed onto the couch between us, turned in a circle, and settled. Phoebe looked at him, then back at me. You're asking me to take a leap. I'm saying I'll be at the other end of it. She didn't say yes that night, but she didn't say no, and she didn't let go of my hand until we went to sleep. She took the contract. She told me on a Wednesday over the phone because she'd gone into her studio to edit, and the confirmation email had come in while I was at a site visit in Beaverton. By the time I got home, she was already in my kitchen making tea with the key she'd had since the night of Det's gravity inspection. I accepted, she said when I walked in. She was watching the kettle. I know. You're sure? Phoebe. I came up behind her and rested my hands on her shoulders. She leaned back slightly. I meant what I said. She turned the kettle off and turned around. Her eyes were bright in the particular way that meant she was managing something. I hate that you live downstairs, she said. I'm going to have to get a cat door that goes to a different floor. Dept would abuse that privilege. Immediately, she pressed her forehead against my shoulder. I don't know how to do this. Neither do I. We'll figure it out. You're infuriatingly calm. I'm not calm. I'm committed to not making this smaller than it is. She pulled back and looked at me. Then she kissed me in a way that had nothing performative in it, just the weight of two people who had spent a long time being careful and had decided to stop. The 2 months before she left were ordinary, in the way that only matters when you know it's temporary. We marked things without meaning too. The last time she made French onion soup in the apartment above mine, the last Sunday morning coffee run on Belmont where it rained, and we stood under the awning pretending not to mind. The night before her flight, I helped carry boxes to the storage unit she rented on Clinton, and we stopped for burritos at 11, because neither of us felt like cooking. We ate in the car. It was not romantic. It was better than romantic. You're going to be fine, I said. I know. She looked out the windshield. I just want both things. You can have both things. She looked at me. People keep saying that. It usually just means do twice as much. I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting we're two adults who can manage a time difference without it becoming your second full-time job. I reached over and took a French fry from the bag in her lap. She didn't comment. The weight has to be shared. If it isn't, we say so. She handed me the bag. You can have more than one. Thank you. It's a gift. Deeply moving. She laughed, finally, and the tension that had been sitting between us all evening broke apart. She reached over and fixed the zipper pull on my jacket that had been twisted sideways for a week, one of those small things she noticed without announcing. I watched her do it without saying anything. I'm going to miss this, I said. The burritos? You fixing the thing I didn't notice was broken. She went still for a moment. Then she leaned over and kissed my cheek. I'll be back before summer. I'll be there before that. She held me to it. I booked a flight in February, 10 days in March. We walked through the Oltrarno neighborhood in the rain, and she showed me the church where she'd shot her first Italian ceremony, 200 guests, and a priest who'd had opinions about the settings she chose. I found a structural landscaping firm that had done green roof work on a historic palazzo restoration and asked if I could shadow their site engineer for an afternoon. He said yes, because he was delighted anyone outside Italy cared. Phoebe photographed me in a hard hat and sent it to my mother before I could ask her not to. We didn't discuss the future formally in Florence. We didn't need to. It was in the way she knew what I would order before I looked at the menu, and the way I'd learned to arrive at her apartment door there without knocking first. It was in the fact that she had made a list of green infrastructure contractors in Portland and texted it to me without prompting, because she'd heard me mention a project that needed exactly that, and because she paid attention to what I was working on the same way I'd paid attention to her prints. And long distance was not romantic most of the time. It was calls that started at 10 Portland time, because Florence runs 9 hours ahead, and one of us was always fighting sleep. It was her missing a weekend trip to the coast I'd planned around her being home, and both of us having to say out loud that it was fine when it wasn't entirely fine. It was Det staying in my apartment for 3 weeks when her subletter fell through, and discovering that he had developed strong opinions about my houseplants, all of them negative. But it was also, genuinely, a choice every week. Not a dramatic choice, not a cinematic one. Just the small, repeated decision to show up for something inconvenient to maintain, and maintaining it anyway because neither of us wanted to find out what stopping felt like. She came back in July. I drove to PDX, and she walked out of arrivals with a carry-on I didn't recognize, and Det's soft carrier over one shoulder, and stopped when she saw me and stood still for a moment, like she was calibrating something. Then she walked straight at me, and I put my arms around her, with the carrier pressed between us and the cat, announcing his displeasure from inside it. "He hates the carrier," she said into my shoulder. "I know. I've been living with him." "How is he?" "He knocked 3 plants off the windowsill. Testing structural integrity, I think." She laughed against me. We stood in the arrivals lane, with someone's rolling suitcase going past, and the fluorescent light doing nobody any favors. She pulled back and looked at me. "I want to say something." "Okay." "I worked on the portrait series in Florence. I finished 12 of them. A gallery on NW 23rd is interested for January." She held my gaze. "And I want to tell you it was the best 6 months of my working life. And also that I spent every Sunday thinking about your kitchen floor, and the candles, and the particular way you listen when you're actually listening. We got better at geography. We got competent. There's a difference." She shifted Depp's carrier to her other shoulder. "I don't want to be competent at long distance anymore. I want to be bad at short distance. I want to be genuinely incompetent at living 2 floors apart." It took me a moment to understand exactly what she was saying. "Phoebe, I'm not suggesting we move in tomorrow. That would be terrifying." "Exactly. But I want to stop pretending separate apartments are a preference and not a holdover from when I wasn't sure yet." She looked at me steadily. "I'm sure." Something loosened in my chest that I had not known was still holding tension. "I had a shelf installed," I said. She blinked. "What?" "In my apartment, 3 months ago. On the theory that if you ever wanted to keep your camera bag somewhere permanent, it would have a dedicated space." She stared at me. "You installed a shelf." "It's adjustable." She looked at me for a long moment, then started laughing, the real kind, from somewhere deep. I took Det's carrier from her because she was laughing too hard to hold it steady, and Det protested the transfer loudly. "You absolute disaster," she said. "It's a good shelf." It's the most Asher thing I've ever heard in my life. I measured twice. She kissed me in the middle of baggage claim, with Det objecting, and a family with matching luggage sets giving us a sideways look. I did not care at all. She tasted like the coffee she'd had in the terminal, and she had the particular warmth of someone coming in from outside, and I held on a beat longer than was strictly necessary. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. "The shelf better be the right height." "For you?" "For the camera bag." I measured that too. She took my hand and we went to get her luggage, and Det protested the entire walk to the carousel, which is how I knew he was genuinely glad to be home. What would you have done if the person you'd been quietly paying attention to, for months, finally stopped letting you be quiet about it? Have you ever been the one who needed something specific to dare you to act? Tell me your story in the comments, and if you'd like to be a little closer to us here, at Whispered Barely, we've opened memberships where you'll get shorter, exclusive stories every week. No ads, just the story from start to finish. If this one meant something to you, Leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.